They were built to fight at Jutland, massive steel fortresses designed for one purpose: exchanging salvos with German battleships in the North Sea. The 5 Revenge-class battleships, Revenge Resolution, Ramillies, Royal Oak, and Royal Sovereign, entered service between 1916 and 1917, armed with 8 15-inch guns, protected by thick armour, and capable of the 21-knot speed that was considered adequate for line of battle in World War I. They were designed for the naval warfare of their era fleet actions, where battleships would steam in formation close to gun range and pound each other until one side withdrew or was destroyed. That war ended in 1918. By 1939, when war returned, everything about naval warfare had changed. Aircraft carriers had replaced battleships as the decisive naval weapon. Submarines threatened surface ships from beneath. Aircraft attacked from above. Radar allowed engagements beyond visual range. The Revenge-class battleships designed for a war 20 years past found themselves fighting a war they weren't designed for in roles. They weren't built for against threats they had no defense against. This is the story of how World War I battleships fought in World War II. How the Royal Navy tried to adapt obsolete ships to modern war through added anti-aircraft guns, radar systems, and improved fire control. How these battleships were relegated to convoy escort and shore bombardment because fleet duels never happened, and how their fundamental vulnerability to aircraft and submarines made them dangerous to crew and expensive to operate. It's a story about obsolescence, about fighting with what you have rather than what you need, and about how technology advances faster than navies can build ships to match it. The Revenge class was already considered slow when commissioned in 1916-1917. The contemporary Queen Elizabeth class battleships, completed slightly earlier, could make 24 knots compared to Revenge class's 21 knots. This 3-knot difference was significant. It meant Revenge class couldn't keep up with the fast battleships that formed the core of the battle fleet. They were assigned to secondary squadrons, used for convoy escort and patrol duties, even in World War I. After the war ended, all 5 ships remained in service through the interwar period, receiving periodic refits that updated some systems but couldn't address fundamental design limitations. By 1939, they were among the oldest battleships in the Royal Navy, outclassed by newer construction, but still useful for roles where their heavy guns and armour remained relevant. When World War II began in September 1939, the Revenge-class ships were immediately mobilised for convoy escort in the Atlantic. Their primary mission was protecting convoys from German surface raiders, the pocket battleships Deutschland and Admiral Graf Spee. The battlecruisers Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, later the battleship Bismarck. A Revenge-class battleship accompanying a convoy made attacking that convoy extremely risky for German raiders. The 15-inch guns could destroy any German surface ship, except Bismarck and Tirpitz at battle range. But convoy escort was tedious, slow-speed work that exposed battleships to submarine attack, while preventing them from engaging in the fleet actions they were designed for. The ships steamed endless circles around convoys, burning fuel and wearing out machinery, rarely seeing action, but always vulnerable. The vulnerability to submarines became tragically apparent on October 14, 1939, when HMS Royal Oak was sunk at anchor in Scapa Flow, the Royal Navy's main base in Scotland. German submarine U-47, commanded by Günther Prien, penetrated Scapa Flow's defences at night, fired torpedoes at Royal Oak, and escaped. The battleship capsized in 13 minutes, killing 833 crew members. It was catastrophic loss, one of Britain's capital ships, sunk at anchor in supposedly secure harbour by single submarine. The sinking demonstrated that World War I-era battleships, designed before effective submarine warfare existed, were vulnerable to weapons they had no defence against. Royal Oak's anti-torpedo protection was inadequate by 1939 standards. Her underwater protection system, designed to defeat World War I torpedoes, couldn't handle the more powerful torpedoes of 1939. The loss led to improved anti-submarine defences at Scapa Flow and reinforced the reality The old battleships were increasingly obsolete in modern war. The remaining 4 Revenge-class ships received extensive modifications throughout the war to improve their effectiveness and survivability. The most visible changes were the addition of anti-aircraft guns. In 1939, the ship's AA armament was minimal: a few 4-inch guns, some smaller weapons, nothing adequate for defending against modern aircraft attack. By 1943 and 1944, after multiple refits, the ships bristled with AA weapons, dozens of 20mm Oerlikon guns, multiple 40mm Bofors guns in quadruple mounts, improved 4-inch guns in twin mounts. These weapons transformed the ship's silhouettes, adding gun positions across superstructures and decks, creating bristling appearance of ships prepared for air attack. The AA guns provided some defense against aircraft, but fundamentally they couldn't solve the problem that slow large battleships were excellent targets for aerial attack. The guns could shoot down some attacking aircraft, but determined air attack with sufficient numbers could overwhelm defenses. Radar was the other major technological addition. When the war began, Revenge-class ships had no radar. By 1943, they carried multiple radar systems: surface search radar for detecting ships, air search radar for detecting aircraft fire control, radar for directing gunfire. Radar transformed naval warfare by allowing engagements at night and in poor visibility, by providing early warning of air attacks, and by improving gunnery accuracy. For the Revenge-class, radar partially compensated for their age by giving them capabilities newer ships possessed. But radar couldn't make them faster, couldn't improve their underwater protection, couldn't fundamentally change what they were: slow battleships vulnerable to modern threats. Fire control improvements were more subtle but equally important. The ship's original World War I-era fire control systems were adequate for their time, but obsolete by 1939. Modern fire control systems used mechanical computers to calculate firing solutions accounting for target speed, range, wind, and ship motion. Upgraded fire control gave the Revenge-class better accuracy at long range, making their 15-inch guns more effective when they could engage targets. But improved fire control was wasted capability if the ships never engaged surface targets, which was largely the case. The improved systems were installed for the possibility of surface action, but that possibility rarely materialized. The operational reality of World War II for the Revenge-class was that they spent the war doing jobs they weren't designed for and avoiding the battle they were designed to fight. Fleet actions between battleships were rare. The few times British battleships engaged German capital ships, hunting Bismarck in 1941, engaging Scharnhorst in 1943, the Revenge-class wasn't involved because they were too slow to keep up with the fast battleships and carriers that formed the pursuit forces. Instead, Revenge-class ships escorted convoys, conducted shore bombardments, served as floating batteries, and provided presence that deterred German surface raids. These were important roles, but they were not what 15-inch gun battleships were optimized for. Resolution and Ramillies both participated in the hunt for Bismarck in May 1941, but neither engaged. They were too far away when the action happened, too slow to close the distance. Bismarck was sunk by more modern battleships, King George V and Rodney, supported by aircraft from carrier Ark Royal. The Revenge-class ships were supporting players in drama where they were obsolete. This was frustrating for crews who wanted to fight in the ship's designed role, but was realistic assessment of capabilities. Resolution and Ramillies could have engaged Bismarck if positioned correctly, but positioning slow battleships to intercept fast targets required either luck or perfect intelligence, neither reliably available. Shore bombardment became an increasingly important role for the Revenge-class as the war progressed. Their heavy guns were excellent for bombarding coastal targets, fortifications, troop concentrations, logistics hubs. Resolution and Ramillies both participated in shore bombardment during the North African campaign, firing on targets in Libya and Egypt. Ramillies bombarded Vichy French positions at Madagascar in 1942, during Operation Ironclad, the British invasion of Madagascar, to prevent Japanese use of the island's ports. The shore bombardment role utilized the ship's heavy guns effectively, while keeping them away from situations where their vulnerabilities would be exposed. A battleship firing at land targets from several miles offshore wasn't vulnerable to submarine attack. Submarines couldn't reach firing positions where battleships operated with destroyer screens. Aircraft attacks were still dangerous, but shore bombardment positions could be chosen to minimize air threat. The Mediterranean theater saw Revenge-class ships in some of their most active roles. Ramillies spent significant time in the Mediterranean, escorting convoys to Malta, supporting operations in North Africa, bombarding shore targets. The Mediterranean was dangerous theater, where German and Italian aircraft were numerous and aggressive. Ramillies was attacked multiple times, suffering damage, but surviving. The ship's heavy AA armament proved valuable shooting down attacking aircraft and deterring others. But the fundamental vulnerability remained a slow battleship was target, that aircraft could attack repeatedly, and only luck and AA fire prevented catastrophic damage. The most dramatic incident for the Revenge class came in May 1941, when Ramillies was attacked at night by Italian E-boats, motor torpedo boats off Crete. The E-boats penetrated destroyer screen and launched torpedoes at the battleship. One torpedo struck Ramillies, causing flooding and damage that required repairs. The ship survived, but was out of action for months. This incident demonstrated that even within formations protected by escorts, old battleships were vulnerable to fast attack craft using torpedoes, exactly the same threat that had sunk Royal Oak at Scapa Flow, now coming from surface craft rather than submarines. Resolution spent much of the war in the Atlantic and later in the Indian Ocean. The ship participated in Operation Menace in September 1940, the failed Allied attempt to capture Dakar in French West Africa. During this operation, Resolution was torpedoed by Vichy French submarine and severely damaged, requiring extensive repairs that took her out of action for over a year. This was second major torpedo hit on a Revenge-class ship, reinforcing pattern that underwater attacks were the greatest threat. After repairs, Resolution served in the Indian Ocean, providing presence against possible Japanese naval incursions and escorting convoys. The Indian Ocean was safer theater than Atlantic or Mediterranean. Japanese naval forces rarely operated that far west, and submarine threat was lower. Resolution's service there was uneventful but useful, freeing more modern ships for active theaters. Royal Sovereign had perhaps the most unusual wartime service of any Revenge-class ship. In 1944, as part of Allied cooperation with Soviet Union, Royal Sovereign was transferred to the Soviet Navy, renamed Arkhangelsk, and served with the Soviet Northern Fleet until 1949. The transfer was complicated by political and technical issues. Soviet Navy had different procedures, different ammunition, different maintenance standards. Royal Sovereign Arkhangelsk saw limited action under Soviet command, participating in some convoy escort missions, but mostly serving as training ship and symbol of Allied cooperation. The ship was returned to Royal Navy in 1949 and scrapped shortly afterward. The Soviet service demonstrated that even obsolete battleships retained some value as flagships and symbols, if not as frontline combatants. Revenge herself spent the war in less active roles than her sisters. The ship conducted convoy escort in the Atlantic and later transferred to the Indian Ocean. Revenge was oldest of the class, commissioned in 1916, and by 1943 was clearly obsolete. The ship was relegated to training duties and reduced readiness in 1944, reflecting Royal Navy's assessment that the resources required to maintain an old battleship operationally weren't justified when the ship offered little capability that couldn't be provided by more modern vessels. Revenge was scrapped in 1948, having survived the war but having contributed less than her sisters. The vulnerability to aircraft was demonstrated repeatedly throughout the war, though the Revenge class was fortunate that none were sunk by air attack. Other British battleships weren't as lucky. Prince of Wales and Repulse were sunk by Japanese aircraft off Malaya in December 1941, demonstrating that even modern battleships were vulnerable to sustained air attack without air cover. The older, slower Revenge-class ships would have been even more vulnerable. The The Royal Navy learned to operate battleships only where air cover was available either from carriers or land-based aircraft. This limited where battleships could operate and what missions they could perform. The era when battleships could operate independently, dominating sea areas through their guns and armour, was over. Battleships in World War II were supporting elements in combined arms, task forces dependent on carriers and aircraft for protection, vulnerable when that protection failed. The cost of operating Revenge-class battleships was substantial. These ships required large crews, over 1,000 men, each consuming resources that could have manned multiple smaller vessels. They burned tremendous amounts of fuel oil. Consumed supplies required constant maintenance. Their machinery was old and increasingly unreliable, requiring more maintenance as the war progressed. The Royal Navy kept them in service because capital ships were scarce, particularly in 1939 to 1942, when losses were high and new construction hadn't yet entered service. But by 1944, 1945, when new King George V class battleships and fleet carriers were available, the Revenge-class ships were clearly more expensive to maintain than they were worth operationally. All surviving ships were decommissioned shortly after the war ended and scrapped. The comparison with more modern battleships is instructive. The King George V class, commissioned 1940 to 1942, were faster 28 knots, better protected, better armed, 10 guns in a better arrangement, and equipped from the start with modern AA armament radar and fire control. They could accompany carriers, engage enemy capital ships, and survive in modern combat environments. The Revenge class couldn't do these things. They were too slow for carrier task forces, too vulnerable to air attack for independent operations, too old in design to be effective in modern fleet actions. Their continued service was testament to Britain's shortage of capital ships, not to their effectiveness. The strategic question is whether the resources devoted to keeping Revenge-class ships operational could have been better spent elsewhere. Each Revenge-class battleship required over 1,000 crew members. Those 4,000 and 5,000 men could have manned dozens of destroyers, corvettes, or submarines. The fuel oil consumed by battleships steaming in circles around convoys could have fueled convoy escorts that were more effective anti-submarine platforms. The maintenance resources, shipyard time, spare parts, technical personnel could have supported vessels more useful for the war Britain was actually fighting. But this analysis is hindsight. In 1939 to 1943, Britain needed every capital ship available, and the Revenge-class ships, while obsolete, were what was available. They performed useful service in roles they were adequate for, and they freed more modern ships for frontline duties. Whether this was optimal use of resources is debatable, but it was practical use of what existed. The human experience of serving on Revenge-class battleships was a mixture of boredom, discomfort, and occasional terror. The ships were old, cramped, poorly ventilated, hot in tropical climates and cold in northern waters. Crew members stood watch, conducted maintenance, trained for action that rarely came. When action came, air attacks, submarine scares, shore bombardment missions, it was intense and frightening. The ship's crews knew they were on obsolete vessels, knew that aircraft and submarines could sink them, knew that their AA guns might not be enough. But they served professionally, maintained their ships, and fought when called upon. The loss of Royal Oak was a psychological blow that reminded everyone that old battleships could be sunk, that no ship was truly safe, that service on capital ships was dangerous, even when those ships rarely engaged in surface combat. The technological gap between World War I and World War II naval warfare was profound, and the Revenge-class ships embodied that gap. They were designed when aircraft were primitive, when submarines were coastal defense weapons, when radar didn't exist, when naval battles were decided by gun duels at visual range. By 1939, all those assumptions were obsolete. Aircraft could sink battleships. Submarines could torpedo them in harbour. Radar allowed beyond visual range engagements. The Revenge-class ships were adapted as much as possible to new realities, but adaptation has limits. You can add AA guns, but you can't make a slow ship fast. You can install radar, but you can't strengthen underwater protection without complete rebuilds that would cost more than new construction. The ships served because they were available and better than nothing, but they were never truly adequate for the war they fought. The fate of the class after the war was swift. Royal Oak was already sunk. Revenge, Resolution, Ramillies, and Royal Sovereign were all decommissioned by 1949 and scrapped shortly afterward. There was no consideration of preserving them as museum ships or keeping them in reserve. They were obsolete before the war, ancient by its end, and Britain's post-war austerity made maintaining old battleships impossible. The scrap metal from their hulls was probably more valuable than the ships themselves. None survive today. Their legacy is as symbols of technological obsolescence, as examples of how military equipment designed for one war becomes liability in the next, and as memorial to the crews who served on them and died on Royal Oak. The lesson of the Revenge class is that naval technology advances faster than ships can be built, that today's cutting-edge capital ship is tomorrow's obsolete liability, and that navies must constantly modernize or accept operating with inadequate equipment. The Royal Navy, in 1939, knew the Revenge class was obsolete, but kept the ships in service because alternatives didn't exist. Britain entered the war with insufficient modern capital ships, insufficient aircraft carriers, insufficient everything. The Revenge class filled gaps in the battle line, provided presence where presence was needed, and served in secondary roles that utilized their remaining capabilities. They were not war-winning ships. They were gap fillers that allowed Britain to fight with what it had while building what it needed. That's an important role, even if it's not glorious. Wars are won with available forces, not with ideal forces, and the Revenge class was what was available. They served, they contributed, and most importantly, they allowed Britain to survive the dangerous early years of the war when modern ships were scarce and losses were high. That's their legacy, unglamorous, obsolete, but useful enough to matter when mattering was critical. The Revenge class fought yesterday's war in tomorrow's conflict and somehow made it work well enough to survive. That's worth remembering.